Hello and welcome to today's 18 group webinar on managing culture and conduct. Is your organization compliant with the senior managers and certification regime, also known obviously as SMCR? My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18 Group and I'll moderate today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Keith Pike, Solutions Director at MCO or My Compliance Office, Dirk Young, SMCR Lead at Jupiter Asset Management, Sarah Farouk, Director Compliance at Barings Asset Management, and Louise Gowland, Head of EMEA Conduct Office, Senior Vice President at Northern Trust. I'll come back and ask them to introduce themselves in just a few minutes, but first a few notes for you so that you can make best use of the webinar. Beside your screen to the right, you'll see a box for questions and polls. We'll put up 3 polls during today's webinar, so do please vote. It's always interesting to gauge your views of what we're talking about. We'll also be answering any of your questions, so if you'd like to put some questions to the speakers, please use the questions channel. We'll ask those as we go along through the webinar so that we get to as many as we can. So please feel free to pop in a question whenever you want to, and we'll get to as many as we can. Okay, that's it from me. So let me come to our speakers and ask them to introduce themselves. Coming first to you, Keith. I think you've got your mute on.
I do.
That's better. That's okay.
There we go. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Pike, and I'm the Director and Head of our Solution Sales team at My Compliance Office. My Compliance Office is a leading provider of conduct risk automation software, and I've been heavily involved in our implementation of a solution for SMCR for the last number of years. So I'm delighted to be part of this panel today.
Lovely. Thank you. Dirk, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Dirk Young. I'm Head of SMCR at Jupiter Asset Management. Very happy to be here to be part of this panel. Just a bit of background from my perspective. I was in charge of the implementation of the senior managers regime at Barclays when the senior managers regime first got implemented in 2016 to banks. I've also been in compliance in various roles within investment banks, Barclays, Deutsche Bank, and Credit Suisse, and have an experience of compliance overall in that regard. But looking forward to talking about SMCR today.
Thank you very much indeed. And over to you, Sarah.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah Farouk, and I'm a director in the compliance team at Barings, primarily working on advisory activities. So I'm responsible for new regulation, implementation and policy, and I led our implementation of SMCR, and it's lovely to be here today with you all.
Good to have you. Thank you. And Louise.
Good afternoon, Louise Gowland from Northern Trust. I head up the EMEA Conduct Office, which is a first line of defence function that operates under a delegated authority from the relevant entity CEOs and heads of overseas branch. I have been at Northern for coming up to 20 years, 10 of which I spent in compliance before moving over to the Conduct Office in 2017. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Great. Thank you, everybody. That's fantastic. Looking forward to it too. But first, before we start the discussion, let's run an audience poll question. The question is, how confident is your organization in its implementation of SMCR? So while you answer that, I should imagine that's quite an easy question, really. Let me come to you, Louise, if I may. And setting the scene, tell us to what extent you think SMCR is actually visible and clearly operational across financial institutions.
So I think if properly embedded, the SMCR should be known at varying levels across firms, depending on how directly impactful the regime is to a particular employee, their position in the firm, and their understanding of the firm's control structure. For example, by that I mean the top layer of management who are entrenched in a firm's governance structure and will likely form part of the SMF population. They'll have a greater understanding of the regime and how it's supported operationally over and above those that are not. However, as we know, the conduct rules are applicable to all staff except those holding ancillary positions, albeit a lot of firms have actually applied this to that population to ensure best practice. So overall, there should be a good base level understanding throughout organisations.
Okay, that's great. Keith, when you've been working with clients, what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, very much in line with what Louise said. You know, at the top you have your senior managers who are very involved in this. You know, their responsibilities are clearly outlined, and their how they achieve those responsibilities are also clearly outlined, and also, you know, within the process having to be approved by the FCA as well obviously makes it very transparent that this is in place. I think if we move down the organization, maybe it becomes less visible for your certified persons, which maybe makes up, in most cases, will make up the bigger part of that population. But again, you know, from clients that we've been dealing with, there is the annual certification, there is the actual issue of certificates to those people. So I think, you know, across the majority of firms, you know, we would certainly see that it is very visible, and those who are subject to the regime, you know, should be very aware of it, and what is designated on their behalf, particularly, you know, as Louise alluded to, at the top levels where, you know, it's very prescriptive with very defined and clearly defined responsibilities. You know, I think a lot of firms have done a great job in advertising it around the organization as well, and issuing these, you know, annual certifications to ensure, you know, that employees are aware that they are a certified person and the responsibilities that go along with that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see what our audience is thinking. If we could see the poll results. Right, that's very good, isn't it?
There we go.
Yeah, Keith, what do you think to that?
Yeah, no, you know, I'm not surprised. I think, you know, an awful lot of effort has gone on with, you know, with the implementation of SMCR, and I think, to be fair to the regulator, it is a very, very prescribed and very obvious regime. You know, at MCO we deal with global clients as well, and you know, the SMCR is very much a regime that's been copied and been looked upon by other regulatory bodies. So yeah, I'm glad to see it, but I'm also not surprised, I guess.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And thank you for everybody for voting. But we'll be certainly going into the detail for anybody who feels they need more detail during the webinar. So thank you for that. And bringing you in here, Dirk, what are the requirements of SMCR in capital markets, and how have these changed since the regulation, as you mentioned earlier, was introduced in 2016?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I mean, I'll just touch on your last slide, the poll. I think it is quite interesting because, as Keith says, the more prescriptive elements of what applies to the senior managers and certified staff, I think most firms are fairly confident on what needs to be applied. But I think more broadly across SMCR, for things like reasonable steps, which we'll get into today, I think firms are at varying levels in really embedding what that actually means in a kind of BAU environment. So the implementation's done, but then how do we keep the wheels on the track and make sure that the FCA keep on talking about day two requirements? What are people doing to make sure that this continues to be met? But from a perspective of the requirements within capital markets and so on, I think the way I'd summarize that is, you know, SMCR shouldn't be bringing in loads of new stuff for firms. So, you know, the duty of responsibility for senior people, which was then called in the Improved Persons Regime, SIFs, existed, and people needed to meet those requirements. Likewise, the way in which people should conduct themselves also existed. So the very high-level conduct rules like act with integrity, act with due skill, care, diligence, that's something that's been in the financial markets for some time. So a lot of this stuff shouldn't be new. I think what's coming in clearly is a better level of formalization of evidencing some of this stuff. So, you know, historically, people would be aware of what their responsibilities are, but a lot of decisions may well have been made in a meeting room, in a board where it wasn't necessarily minuted, but effectively verbally agreed. Whereas really what SMCR brings is a better formalization around those steps you needed to take in order to document key decisions that you're making as a senior manager for what you're responsible for, and just a slightly different discipline in deciding on how you do that and how you document that. You'll get people that are very detailed in their documentation, and you'll get people that don't really like documenting things. So you're going to get a varied response to that. But it does bring a level of formalization, and certainly in the firms I've worked, we have needed to formalize these things. the way we operate isn't hugely different. We're still doing the same things. We're still focusing on the same things, but we're creating processes and governance committees and forums which allow our senior managers to more naturally record decisions and so on. So I think formalization is a key element that's come in. I think Keith touched on certification. The big change under SMCR from the last approved persons regime is historically the FCA would have been responsible for a lot of the fitness and proprietary checks for registered people and so on, and that would appear on the FCA register. It's now up to firms to make sure that their fitness and proprietary processes and requirements are being met for their certified population. So there's been a bit of a shift there. So it's now firms that are responsible for ensuring that happens. And the way the regulators make sure that firms focus on that, there'll be one individual, one senior manager in your firm that would have the prescribed responsibility around certification. So, certification is something, it's not new, but it's new that firms really need to be having a process and looking at those elements. And I think technology is an it obviously assists and enables you to keep on top of that. And that's something we'll talk about slightly later. And the only other thing I'd touch on is reasonable steps, which I mentioned at the start of my diatribe, which was, each senior manager needs to be able to demonstrate what steps they've taken in different situations, so that, if enforcement come knocking or questions are asked a year in advance, 2 years in advance, it's clear on what happened, what governance was in place, what structures were in place, and what decisions were made and why they were made. And that is something you're going to be asked if there is an enforcement process 2-3 years down the line. And with the best will in the world, you're not going to remember exactly what was said at the time. So it is important to document that and have clear versioning of what that looks like.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Let's run another audience poll here. Everybody seems pretty confident, but where are the hard bits, hey? So let's look at where the challenges of SMCR are at your organization. You can tick as many of the boxes as you like this time, while I come back to Dirk to talk about the challenges SMCR presents for financial institutions. And you've talked a little bit about how that's changed and brought with it from 2016 some slightly new approaches. So where do you see the challenges and meeting compliance?
Yeah, I mean, I think one element is obviously meeting the compliance requirements, and Sarah will talk about this as well. It can't be just the compliance team that's saying you need to meet your SMCR requirements. You need to be able to embed it into the DNA of the way in which that senior manager operates their functional business. So for me, quite a lot of SMCRs are cultural. There's a cultural element to SMCR. So there's meeting the requirements, which you do from an implementation standpoint. But then how do you look at the DNA of your organization or department or business and actually make sure people are thinking about things? And the way I always talk to senior managers and people where I work in trying to embed SMCR is we shouldn't be thinking about SMCR as this separate thing. It should be natural as to, I want to run my business or function. I need to think about my people and the culture of my department or business. I need to make sure that the processes and controls are in place and I have oversight of what those look like. I need the governance in place to make sure I'm documenting my key decisions and everything else. That's how I should run my business effectively and well. And if you're doing all of that, you are meeting the requirements under SMCR. So obviously, whenever a new regime is implemented, people talk about the regime itself, but really, from my perspective, the DNA in operationalizing a lot of SMCR is common sense, running your business is the way you would expect, and you always have, and the likelihood is you'll be meeting that. I think the only element is this formalization where people need to get that discipline of just documenting and evidencing things a little bit more than they may have been used to.
Okay. Sarah, what do you say there? Do you have any challenges when you're sort of implementing, or you've implemented, obviously, and you're, carrying on with the process?
Yeah, so I would definitely echo what Dirk spoke about there, and just sort of diving a bit deeper into formalisation. One of the key challenges for a number of firms is that they are multi-jurisdictional or global, and some other areas in the world already have similar regimes. So Hong Kong, we have the manager in charge regime. MAS in Singapore are in process of putting in another regime, which is again similar. Australia, something is coming in. But a lot of firms have either large or parent entities over in the US, which is completely different. And a lot of us have matrix reporting as well. So one of the challenges I would personally say is not necessarily implementing the regime. So doing the documentation, doing the training, that's the easy part. Dirk mentioned day 2 requirements. So the challenge is making it live and breathe everywhere in the world. Is SMCR at the forefront of everybody's mind? So, when somebody changes reporting lines, are they thinking about SMCR? Do they know there's going to be an impact? Similarly, if we look at employment law in the US, they don't have employment contracts. They're employees at will. So where we have put language into those in scope, into their employment contracts, obviously we can't do that with the US. And sometimes there are things of a very sensitive nature, or things just happen very quickly in the US because they don't have, 3-month, 6-month notice periods. So that flow of information and that engagement needs to be sort of consistent almost. You have to have open dialogue with the relevant teams overseas all the time, really, to make sure that everybody is aware that actually, if I do this, there is an SMCR impact and we may need to go to the FCA. So I think multi-jurisdictional companies and embedding that consistently and timely is a challenge, and it's improved over the last few years, but I wouldn't say it's perfect in any organization at the moment. So it's just more banging on the drum, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that must be very difficult when people are coming to and from different jurisdictions and fitting in the different regimes. Absolutely. Okay, thank you for that. If we could see the poll results, please. And I don't think international businesses was on there. There you go. Cost, time and resources needed for implementation and compliance, and then translating the purposes of SMCR into everyday practices. Our top selections there. Dirk, what would you say there on those results? What you might expect?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, obviously the cost, time and resources is a key element when we're talking about day 1 implementation and then kind of day 2 BAU stuff. That's exactly it. It's convincing the right individuals within the organization that this isn't a one-off implementation, that we need to continue to do lots of different things to support SMCR within our organizations. And Sarah's point on multi-jurisdictional and international companies is very, very poignant, because you're going to have different processes, whether those be HR or compliance processes globally, registrations, maintaining qualifications, those types of things, and those need to continue to be maintained as you take it forward. So that doesn't surprise me at all. And then, I think on the embedment of SMCR, that's what we were talking about, on reasonable steps, on businesses needing to start thinking about things in a slightly different way.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else like to comment on the poll? Okay, let's move on, and let me come to you, Keith, if I may, and tell us a little bit about sort of best practice approaches financial institutions in particular can take to compliance with SMCR. As you said, it sort of runs right through the firm. Where do you start?
Yeah, and obviously we've sort of been discussing the senior managers regime and the certification regime as well, but then also to take into account the conduct rules, which are more broad than that and should really apply to all employees. So that's something, I think Dirk mentioned it as well, a cultural aspect to SMCR. So obviously, there's the certification piece and there's the management of the documentation that goes along with that. But it does call out to a cultural aspect within organizations to look at holistically as part of that. And one aspect to that is the conduct rules and how they get applied to all staff, not just your senior managers or your certified staff. But, as far as integrating SMCR within the organization, having senior managers or committees leading the implementation, I think is something as a best practice can be brought in. Setting up a central team to provide advice on the application of the regime. Again, not everybody is going to be legal and know exactly what it is, what the regime is there for. So having a centralized area where employees can go to get advice on it, and of course then training and workshop for new managers who assume new responsibilities. Ensuring that they are aware of these responsibilities and what's expected of them. And then, as I mentioned, broad-based training on conduct rules across the organization, so that everybody at the organization is aware of what's expected from them from a conduct standpoint. And then that becomes culturally, I think something Dirk said as well was just around, it is common sense, right? And if we're managing our organizations in a sensible way, a lot of this should just be reiterating, what's expected of employees. But unfortunately, common sense is not that common, and some organizations, have issues. So I think just having those workshops and having those training sessions can go a long way to helping with the embedding of the learnings from the regime.
Okay, thank you very much. If you're like me, there are probably people listening thinking, yeah, why do we have SMCR in the first place if everybody's, very well behaved and thinking about things? But obviously things do happen and they need to be traced. Absolutely. Coming to you, Louise, how do you see sort of the best sort of approaches for financial institutions? And you've done this yourself. What's the good way to do this?
Yes, I think talking more to the high level aspects, as Keith covered the finer detail, I think the key here really is to reflect the reality of the organisation. The SMCR may cause firms to sort of refine their governance practices and how they approach things more broadly, but the intention of the regime is not to cause firms to restructure themselves to meet the requirements of the regime. Secondly, ensuring that and Sarah and Dirk had touched upon this already, but ensuring that there is accountability in the first line defence. This is absolutely not a compliance project. It needs to be owned by those that are responsible for the culture of the firm. And then finally, again, something that was covered earlier is having that good connectivity and a collaborative view with other stakeholders is integral to making the SMCR implementation a success. For example, HR, compliance, and the need to demystify the requirements of the regime, particularly those that are working in a global operating model, addressing the fact that strategy may be set globally, but there is accountability for its implementation within the UK entity locally, and that's where the SMF accountability will come in.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We have a couple of audience questions, and one asks a little bit more actually about something that Dirk mentioned, and I'll put it to you, Dirk. You mentioned reasonable steps. Who's the decider of the reasonable steps, and how do you know you've done the right thing?
That's a good question. I think it's a bit like anything with the implementation of the SMCR framework. It's a discussion that needs to be taken at the most senior committee level as to how you're going to apply it. The thing that I would say specifically about reasonable steps is it obviously needs to encompass what your senior manager conduct rules are. So you need to encompass the steps that you take to meet those. And at the same time, you need to have a consistent set of reasonable steps for your senior manager population is what I would say. What you don't want is one senior manager doing these 5 things and another senior manager doing a different 4 to meet the same requirement. So I think the way in which I've done it in the firms I've worked for is you come up with some design principles, you agree on what those look like, what underpins your reasonable steps framework. So as a guide, we use 4 different pillars. We have culture and people, we have organizational design, we have governance, and we have process and control. And those are the 4 pillars that we use. And then there are a number of activities we would expect each senior manager to be able to demonstrate in each one of those pillars to carry on meeting their ongoing responsibilities, like delegation of activities and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And I think I'm going to ask both our practitioners, Louise and Sarah, this one. Let me come to you first, Louise. It asks, do you think SMCR has had a positive or negative effect on executives considering going for promotion at financial firms?
So I would say that that's probably a mixed bag. I think in the very early days when the SMCR came in, there was all of a sudden quite a few well-seasoned executives took retirement. Not at Northern Trust, I'm talking across the industry. Whereas others see it as an opportunity very much, to step up and take on that next level of management. So I do think it's very much personal choice, and it's also truly understanding the regime and how to manage the requirements of the regime, because if you manage your reasonable steps appropriately, there's probably nothing to be too nervous about.
Okay. Okay, that's great. Sarah, what would you say there?
I'd echo that, and still, I think even though we're almost 2 years in, whenever you're looking to bring a new senior manager in, everybody still asks what's my personal liability for doing this question. And I don't think that's necessarily changed from the approved persons regime. People would ask that then. Other than that, everybody's happy to do it. There is more documentation, but if you are able to assist and work with senior managers, and as Dirk was saying earlier, it is common sense. It's just about formalising what you're doing. It's probably positive because it makes life easier for legal, compliance, HR, and so on, because everything is documented better.
Okay, fine. That's interesting. It's coming from the practitioners. Obviously, it's a different thing to sitting on the outside here. So thank you. And thank you for your questions, audience. And if you have any more, please do send them in. We will have a little bit of time, I think. So next, Dirk, I'm going to come back to you. We're going to start talking about solutions and technology. How can firms access and implement a technology solution? We've talked about that. Implementation, not the technology, but the implementation is relatively straightforward. And then how can technology help with the recertification process, which we've also touched on, which is probably the harder thing to sort of keep up with constantly as jobs change, geographies change, and so on. What would you say in terms of getting some kind of tech support in here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know in the audience how large the firms are that people work for, but I would say that if you have anything north of 40 certified staff, I would strongly suggest and recommend some form of technology solution for your firms, and the reason I say that is it's twofold. So I'll cover it in two points here. So one is the requirements and the regulatory submissions and what you need to evidence on a go-forward basis from a senior manager standpoint. And then separately is the recertification and a certified staff piece. So a lot of these solutions, and certainly the solution that we use, has enables you to be able to document all the responsibilities an individual has. And the committees they're part of, and so on and so forth, and bring that together to create what's called a management responsibility map. So what that enables you to do is to have a look at all of your SMFs across the organization, what prescribed responsibilities they have, so that's the responsibilities that regulators prescribe to be allocated for a particular firm, and then other responsibilities or overall responsibilities, depending what type of firm you are. It's all in one place. And what a lot of these systems do is map that together and make it very obvious as to have all the responsibilities be allocated effectively. Are there duplicate responsibilities? Are there some missing? Do I need to allocate another one? What steps do I need to take from a regulatory perspective in submitting, I won't bore people, like a Form J or whatever type of regulatory submission is required. So it brings together the entire governance of SMCR and what a regulator would expect to see on what's been allocated. What it also has done is enabled better governance, forgetting about SMCR, better governance for senior executives in firms. So I've been asked the question a lot of times, that's great, seeing that management responsibility map at an entity level. I want one of those for my direct reports in my department. I really like the way this looked, and it's very clear as to what's delegated and who's responsible for what in my organization. So the good governance piece that comes out of SMCR is really biting, and that technology allows you to do that. I think a key element of technology is and which helps firms, is the versioning. So I've been in compliance for a long time, over 20 years. And the amount of times there's been an investigation or even an internal audit review or an external audit question for listed firms of, what did you do then? Or, can you show me when this person was certified or whatever it might be? And then you panic and you're going through, oh, I'm pretty sure I sent an email on this date. And then you're looking at an Excel document. Oh, when did I change? What these systems do is make it very clear and give people reminders as to when someone needs to be certified, and then ensures that you effectively operationalize and have a record of all parts of the fitness and proprietary process that you're expected to do with certified staff. And then I'm sure Keith will talk about this when he says a few things, but you then have to do the annual refresh. And it starts to get quite complicated because you have people joining the firm at a particular date. You then have to do an F&P refresh at least annually. And you effectively have to do that. And then there are different elements and HR processes that feed through. So the versioning and keeping on top of and being able to demonstrate when you did this for different types of individuals and firms. And I think what added on to this, the FCA in March this year brought through the requirements of the FCA directory. So, the directory is effectively a directory of all the submissions firms have to give about their certified staff and what they're certified to do. Any changes to that directory need to be made within 7 days. So you need notification of those changes. If you're taking on another significant harm function, or you're leaving the firm, or you're changing department, whatever it may be, you only have seven days to update that, and you need to keep those dates present and valid. So all of these different processes and elements, and some of them are regulatory requirements that need to be met. Technology solutions will enable you to do that. If you're a firm which has got 3 senior managers and 10 certified staff, then by all means you can probably do it on Excel and email. But if it gets much beyond that, with internal audit asking questions, external audit regulators, thematic reviews by regulators, visits by regulators, really a technology solution will really assist you in meeting your requirements.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And before we come to Keith to talk about things from a sort of solutions provider and what he sees in the market, and ergo what MCO provides, Sarah, would you like to add to that in terms of what's needed?
I think following on from what Dirk mentioned, even if you were to have, say, 30 certified staff, if you have multiple regulated entities, you are looking to go through the certification process for each individual, for each entity, and then issuing a certificate for each entity. So doing all of that manually can be quite difficult, and then trying to sort of keep up with that on an ongoing basis, and then having to remove people from the directory and so on for certain firms can become quite cumbersome. So I know Keith will talk about technology solutions, but for us, certainly it has been very, very helpful to have technology assist us in this. We have 5 regulated entities, and a number of our certified staff are certified for 2, some for 3, some for all 5, all doing different functions sometimes. So it would be extremely difficult, and it would need a lot of people resource if doing that manually.
Okay, Keith, tell us how you do it, what the magic is, what you see people needing, and what you provide. A little bit perhaps about automation, and if you see anything else that technology will be able to help with going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you guys hit on a lot of it, right? So we talk a lot about transparency, consistency, a formalized process, and that's what technology does well, right? So you don't need to worry about, oh, how do we do this process, or who did we get approval for, or what way do we go about getting the person certified. They can be with a competent system, you can set up a workflow process, and they can go through the process and ensure that all of the documentation is gathered at the appropriate steps. So whether that's background under disciplinary history, whether it's background checks and screening checks that need to be done at the onboarding process, and then they're allocated into their, into their senior manager's role or as a certified person. So, that transparency and formalization of process, I think, is very important, and ensuring that, it's set up once and it's very easy then for the people to go through, and people are proactively notified when they need to get involved. So when does the supervisor or manager need to get involved? When does HR need to get involved? And then ultimately what steps were followed in order to get this person certified. And that all has to be reproducible and auditable back to regulators to say, okay, on this date and time, we brought the person through the process, we checked their background, we went through their education verification, we went through their experience verification, and we found that they were, fit and proper for this role at that point in time. We then recertified them on this date and time when we found an issue. And this is how we went through the resolution of this issue. So again, being able to create those cases and manage those outside of email on a system that's directly linked back to that individual, I think is extremely helpful for firms, especially for auditing, whether it's internal or by a regulator when an issue or if an issue does arise. So that's something we certainly see firms looking for all of the time. And of course, the recertification process, automating that. So again, everybody knows at a certain point in time they have their recertification process is going to happen. The system is clever enough to do reminders and escalations where they're not completing it on time, and just automating that follow-up and that chasing so that expensive and burdened compliance staff don't need to be chasing 600 different people who haven't recertified, and things like that. I'd also say, there are some tactical solutions out there that help to automate the SMCR process. But looking more broadly at a conduct risk provider that can alert you to changes in a person's conduct or their relationships with outside entities is something that's very important as well, right? So for example, if somebody has got involved in an outside business activity that might now cause a conflict, or their personal trading activity is spiking and it's going beyond what's appropriate, or identifying trends in gifts and entertainment and gifts and hospitality. Those are all aspects that, again, getting to the conduct rule level that regulators are expecting you to monitor at a senior level. It's not just a one-off, here's my responsibilities, here how I meet those responsibilities, but those conduct rules and embedding that within an organization. If you want to trade, you have to pre-clear that and get approval. If you want to give a gift over a certain amount, that needs to go through a predefined approval process. If you want to sit on the board of an external company, that needs to go through an approval process. So, everybody knows what's expected of them, and there's an automated system that will help. Again, if you're dealing with hundreds, thousands of people, you need to have a way to automate that and identify conflicts and say, no, you cannot be part of this board due to, your role here or something along those lines. So, going beyond just the regular, responsibility maps and identifying, of course, alerting when somebody leaves the firm and you need to backfill a space, or if somebody new comes in that they're a senior manager and they need to go through a certain process. But being able to identify the conduct risk issues along the way is a very important part. And it's really at the spirit of what SMCR is all about, and those conduct rules. And not just for senior managers. I keep saying that, it should be inherent within the organization of what our responsibilities are. And I think having a system in place makes employees feel that, okay, this is being monitored. It's not just lip service. It's not just a policy that I blankly sign and agree to when I join the firm. It's actually being monitored. And I'm regularly attesting to this information. So those are some of the kind of key points that a full conduct risk system can help bring to an organization, not just within the bounds of SMCR.
Okay, Keith, that sounds interesting. Do we see machine learning coming in here to a certain extent, or on its way?
Certainly behavioral analytics and looking across business entities and companies and company structures to see where conflicts might be. Certainly is certainly coming in here, Sarah. Being able to identify, okay, somebody has been to an event that, was hosted by a certain third party, and now they've started to buy the stock of that company, or they've started to they've privately invested in a company that's related to that parent company. Those types of behaviors, absolutely. Or is there a reason why somebody has started trading heavily in a certain asset class or certain security type, and being able to map those back to kind of events or changes? And certainly behavioral analytics is playing a big part in this, and technology with centralized data. Again, it's not possible to do any of this with a spreadsheet here and a spreadsheet there and siloed systems. It has to be that integrated approach, and that's what a lot of firms are looking at, is how do we bring all of this together, and how can I use my PAD system, my personal account dealing system, and then link that up to our senior managers, and identify, I always say rules need to be appropriate for the individuals who you're applying them to. So rules that you apply to a senior manager would be different to the rules that you apply to an entry level person.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question here and a question of a question. So my question here is, perhaps one of our practitioners, Louise, you might want to have a go at this. We mentioned evidence quite a while ago, and the question is, how can we evidence what we were doing towards SMCR quickly, effectively, and efficiently? And obviously technology has something to do with that. And like at school, when Ofsted is on its way, everybody throws their hands in their head and says, everybody, 24 hours by 7 this week, Ofsted is coming. What happens when you really have to evidence stuff? How do you do that?
I don't think it's not a point in time of evidencing. There's a living will. You need to continue to keep everything up to date. You need to be disciplined on a daily basis and just get those good governance entrenched within the firm. And it is very daunting at first. It is administratively heavy, but it does become part of BAU very quickly. And so I don't think there ever really should be too much of a mad scramble to evidence where you've taken reasonable steps.
Excellent, thank you. And I think you'd like to raise a point there, Dirk. You have conduct rules, you have committees, you have individuals. How does that all work?
Yeah, no, I think it was just building on what Keith was talking about, is regulators will expect, there's the conduct rules, and each firm needs to manage the conduct rules, and you need to be clear to your staff what the conduct rules mean, and you have to do real scenario-based training to make sure in each situation what it means and what the conduct rules mean. But regulators will expect you to be looking at all types of employee conduct, breaches, and those don't necessarily equate to being conduct rule breaches. These can be simple personal account dealing errors, or like a gifts and entertainment error on what Keith was talking about. But what you have to do is be able to collate those near misses and say, actually, I'm afraid, Sarah, I'll use you as an example. Sarah Underwood, over the last 2 years has had 3 different breaches for 3 different compliance policies. There's actually a conduct and cultural issue for Sarah. There may be a conduct cultural issue for her supervisor or that part of the firm, and so on and so forth. You have to find ways of tracking that across organizations. And what seems to happen from my experience in organizations is it's very siloed. So you might have a risk and compliance system that does one bit, and then you have a risk and governance team that's aligned to a business, which keeps it somewhat different, and so on and so forth. You need to bring that all together and have all of that information at hand to be able to have a look and say, actually, is this the conduct of this individual what we would expect? And if it's not what we would expect, what actions did we take to address their behavior? It might not be a conduct rule breach, but what steps did we take, and what breaches existed at the time? And that's very much something the regulators are interested in, because they'll look at your conduct rule breach submissions annually and they'll go, oh, that's really interesting. You've only had 5 conduct rule breaches and you've got 500 staff. Really, is that the case? Can we dig a bit deeper? And you really need to be able to demonstrate those near misses and what actions you took in relation to those misses. So I just thought I'd mention that. There's a lot of firms in the structure of the SMCR framework that create a conduct type panel to make sure that people are meeting the conduct rules, look at those near misses, look at the F&P issues, the fitness and proprietary issues that are coming up within a firm for that certified population. Look at all of that and look at that in the committee, and then decide what needs to be done if there's any further action. Again, that would vary on size of firm, it would vary on who generally sits on these committees. But from my experience as your chief risk officer, your head of HR, your head of compliance, and some of the key business heads which have employees as part of this committee, and to look at these things holistically as a firm.
Okay, I don't know how you knew what I'd been up to. That's worrying. Sarah, you do this sort of thing at your firm, I think, perhaps. Yeah, it's something that is slightly away from SMCR, but still important.
Yes, and this is the the key objective of SMCR is to improve culture within our industry, and accountability, obviously. So we have something called a conduct panel. So one of the difficulties under this regulation is that there are no prescriptive examples. There are some that are very black and white, but those in the grey area are very hard to identify as conduct breaches. And we have to make sure that all staff are treated fairly and consistently, because if somebody does have a conduct breach and they leave to go elsewhere, we have to put that on their regulatory reference. So our conduct panel consists of HR, legal, and compliance. Risk is involved at a later stage, but that's to make sure any potential conduct breaches are reviewed consistently. Doesn't matter if you're a graduate or the CEO. That's why we've got those people on that committee. And also, if something isn't a conduct breach, what we do then, it's very, very important that they're all treated fairly and objectively, because it will follow you around. And it's very likely that if you do get a conduct breach, then there will be further, you have to have disciplinary action. So just going back to Dirk's point of, if you've breached a few policies, sometimes people do make honest mistakes, and that's where the conduct rules need to be considered, and the individual and their behaviour needs to be considered as well. So just because you've made an error doesn't mean that you'll get a conduct breach. You have to have disciplinary action as well. So, that may be a written warning, your bonus or remuneration might be capped or withdrawn for some reason, or you're dismissed. So just breaching something doesn't mean that you have a conduct breach. And the difficulty about this is some firms may say, if you breach 3 of our policies, you've got a conduct breach. Whereas some might say, if you breach 1, you've got a conduct breach. So although we're 5 years into the regulation, I'm not sure what everybody else thinks, but it's not hugely clear. It's still a firm by firm comparison on how these are being treated. I just thought it was worth highlighting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I hope I come out of it okay. Fine. We have time for a final audience poll. And this one asks, what would be the benefits of SMCR beyond compliance at your organization? So I hope you can see that poll now. Please vote while I come back to Sarah, and you can tick as many boxes as you like. Sort of what are the opportunities? We've probably talked about this a bit. So let's just gather the thoughts here, if we may. Opportunities of getting it right, penalties of getting it wrong.
One of the key opportunities has been for a number of firms to review their governance and committee structures. So as Louise mentioned earlier, this regime is not about changing the way you work, but looking at what you've got in place already. So we reviewed all of our committees. What is it that they're doing? What decisions are they allowed to make? Do we have any other committees that are doing some overlap roles? So we streamlined everything, and as a result, we have a much more robust, streamlined, concise governance structure, and that's in our management responsibilities maps, which I think are great. And even if you're not an enhanced firm, I would recommend putting a management responsibilities map in place internally, because it very much helps that governance structure. Also, there have been very positive signs from a behavioural perspective. By doing these fitness and propriety assessments, everybody is aware of the standards of behaviour that's expected of them. So before all of COVID, you know, we had a ski trip, a staff ski trip, and one of the heads of team came down and spoke to me and said, right, most of my team are going on this trip. I want to remind them about the conduct rules and, you know, what should I say to them? What do you think? And it's always on people's minds, that standard of behaviour. So those are probably two positives on my mind at the moment. Penalties, it's very similar to what penalties were before, actually. So individual penalties, so being fined or, you know, banned from carrying out a regulated role, reputational damage for both the individual and the firm. But I have to say, we've not had really, other than one key fine under SMCR since go live. There have been, I think, something like 34 investigations opened by the FCA. 11 of those were closed without any action. So I think penalties is something that we will have to be on the lookout for, as there has only been one actual fine under SMCR.
Okay, I'm going to move on now and say to Louise, so what happens next? Maybe it will change in that respect. So how do you expect the regulation and penalties for non-compliance to evolve over the next few years? Is it going to get tougher for people? Is it going to become, as people have said, you know, more about just sort of what we do today?
Yes, I think, as Sarah said, it's very difficult because we haven't had that level of output from the regulators yet in this space, but we do understand there are more enforcement actions being taken against firms and SMFs that are in the pipeline, but, you know, no publications to date. So I do expect there to be more moving forward. The current track record shows that it's very difficult for the FCA to bring action against an individual SMF, and clearly the SMFs will fight their corner until the end because it is so career damaging. And so I generally think it's just a case of us having to wait and see.
Okay, lovely. Let's look at those poll results, if we may. And Louise, you might like to comment on this. Okay. What do you think of that, Louise?
Yeah, no surprises, and a great result, really. Accountability, I think, definitely very much so, has become the norm, and I think in a lot of firms it always was the norm. It's just that SMCR has brought that to the fore. Right,
that's great. And then we have 50% beneficial change in culture and behaviours.
Yeah,
50% improved customers' trust in organisation. Very positive things when we often talk about culture in our industry and the difficulties of bringing everybody together. Thank you very much indeed for voting. And let's come to our final question of today. And I'd like to ask you all what guidance you'd give to practitioners working on SMCR compliance. And Dirk, would you start on this, please?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we've touched on this a couple of times today. Is obviously we all implemented SMCR. Well, I hope everyone on the phone did as part of this conference. And when we implemented it, we continually said, you know, what is the things that you need to think about in the implementation? It was buy-in at the top level, at your exco level, and real accountability and ownership of this. You know, Sarah and Louise have both said, you know, this can't just be a compliance thing. This has to be a cultural thing at the top of the firm. That goes for day two and how we take this forward, right? So you've got individuals at the top of the firm that have their prescribed responsibilities and ownership of the regime as a whole. It's about a leadership piece. We talked about in the poll, accountability is becoming the norm. That becomes the norm because people in the organisation look up to those that manage and lead that part of the organisation. And it's quite clear those individuals are taking on the accountability and making it clear that that's incredibly important to what they do. So I think overall, you need to have that buy-in and ownership. And it's not the head of compliance telling people how important this is. It's the CEO and business heads that are telling their staff just how important this all is. I think, we touched on the conduct rules a little bit. I think I totally agree with Sarah on this point, is the whole element about SMCR is cultural, but as part of that, it's about people taking individual accountability for what they do in their financial organizations. And we need to continue to work on making sure people understand what that means. So, Sarah talked about consistency of applying the conduct rules. It's not just that, it's like if anyone in the firm doesn't understand what the conduct rules are about, then you're in trouble. You need to do ongoing training and real scenario-based training, not just online training where you go through different scenarios of what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what intent means in a particular situation, and be very clear with staff on how they will be treated and what process a potential conduct rule breach goes through, because it changes as you go along. So, for example, when this was first implemented in banks, and Louise will remember this, there were some very specific views on whether this applied to your behavior outside of the workplace. And the FCA, in particular, Megan Butler, has come out and given some views of what the FCA think and what they're looking at from a kind of bullying element, from a diversity and inclusion element, from a different types of elements. The interesting piece that Sarah brought out as well was a staff ski trip. Just because you're not in the office, it doesn't mean that your conduct can be something different to what would be expected if you were in the office. So I think there's ongoing education and elements there. And my third piece, without wanting to sound like a broken record, is it's that reasonable steps piece. It's about operationalizing things. It's about making things part of the DNA. It's about SMCR and conduct not being on slide 35, but being on slide 2 or 3 of key presentations business leaders give, and really operationalizing those reasonable steps. So it's very clear what people have done, what people are doing, and there's an evidence and a documentation trail on what they've done.
Thank you. So Keith, some final words from you, please. What advice would you give to our audience?
Yeah, I think some excellent points from Dirk there. Certainly training is key, right? It's not a one and done. Okay, we've implemented it, we've got registered and we're all set. It is a constant reminder, getting the conduct risk, the conduct rules, broadcast so that everybody is aware of them. Scenario-based training is fantastic, and making sure that everybody is aware of those. With any implementation of any function, a top-down implementation is imperative, right? It's got to begin at the top. It's got to be owned by, senior stakeholders in the organization, and they should be seen to own this and to run it. This is not a compliance or a HR function. It is owned by the individuals and the firm as a whole. So those are certainly things. And of course, as a technologist, I'm going to say is to make sure you have some technology to support you in this. Especially for large organizations, it can be complicated with the recertification process. It is formulaic, making sure it's transparent, and making sure that any conduct issues that are documented, are noted, and are investigated the same, whether it's I think Sarah might have mentioned it, whether it's a graduate or whether it's a senior employee, there should be a structure to how issues are identified and how they are investigated, and whether it's viewing previous conduct issues or near misses as well, looking at a person's overall profile, as to how that works. So having the technology that can support you in that, I think is crucial.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much to all our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience today. It's an interesting subject. Subjects I think are always interesting for all of us. And thank you too to MCA for sponsoring today's webinar. It really has been a good conversation. Just before we close up, we've got some exciting news to share with you. Today, we're launching a new content channel called Esg Insight, which is dedicated to environmental, social and governance issues, including data sourcing, data management standards, risk, metrics, and all the rest of it. Take a look at ateaminsight.com/esg.insight, and you can sign up there for free membership and see some of our great content and some of our early video interviews. And there'll be certainly lots more coming along there. Also, if you scroll down your screen to additional options, you'll see some A-team items that may also be of interest to you. You can download our Regulatory Data Handbook 2020-2021, difficult to read, but a useful reference book. We have a forthcoming webinar on managing unstructured data to ensure regulatory compliance and add value. And you can also download our latest handbook, the ESG Handbook 2021. Again, plays into our new channel. But it's a fantastic handbook, actually. I didn't write this one, but it really is very detailed. So really worth having a look at that. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Mike, Dirk, Sarah, and Louise. And thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. Please do complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products and services. So thank you again. And meantime, goodbye.